Hey everyone, this is Carbonite, and today I'm going to be bringing you a deck profile for one of the new ride lines introduced in LBT3. This is going to be Meidell. So if you've ever played Great Nature during V-Series and you're familiar with its lottery mechanic, this deck is very similar to that, except with the major exception that it is actually good, and it actually uses a lot of the lottery mechanics to its advantage, and it has ways of manipulating the deck so that you're not entirely reliant on the lottery. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the ride line. So we start off with the basic D starter, and you move on to your grade 1, which has no skill on ride. Its skill is when you ride over the grade 1. You actually get to reborn a grade 2 or less from your drop, and then you reveal the top card of your deck. This is where you're really at the mercy of the lottery. You reveal the top card of your deck. If it's a trigger unit, the card that you call back from the drop zone gets called as rest, which is kind of a way of making up for the fact that you're going to be drive checking that, because unlike Great Nature's lottery mechanic, you actually don't mill the cards that you reveal. So if you get a trigger unit, it just stays on top. So both you and your opponent are going to know that you have a trigger coming up, so you can call cards or manipulate the deck accordingly. So basically this makes your ride deck free, because whatever you discard, you can just call it back off of this. So it's pretty decent. It kind of sucks when you hit a trigger and you don't have anything else to call, because like normally you would want to swing with the Vanguard, get that crit or get that power and put onto something else so that that hits better numbers too. But it's still fine, and you can still rush with whatever you call if it's a normal unit, so pretty decent. And then the grade 2 has this skill that when it's ridden by the grade 3, you check the top 3 cards of your deck, you choose one of them to leave on top, and you put the rest on in the drop. So basically this sets up for your first grade 3 turn. You can manipulate the top of your deck. You can decide which effect you want, and it's also helpful that the other cards go to the drop zone, because let's say you have some things you don't have a good drop zone set up, so you can just put whatever you need into the drop zone, and then depending on what effect you want, you can put a different card on top. Alright, and so moving on to the main star of the show, we have the grade 3 Meidell herself. So she only has one skill. It is an act once per turn. It kind of sucks that it's once per turn. If this were once per turn, it would be like so much better. But the skill is actually Counterblast 2. I know that's kind of scary, but there are ways of circumventing it. It's not as bad as it seems in initial viewing. You reveal the top card of your deck, and then you perform one of the effects depending on its card type. So if it's a normal unit, you actually get to add that card to your hand. So it's like CB1, draw a card if it's a normal unit. And then you choose a card for your drop, and you call it to rear guard. And then that called unit gets an extra critical until end of turn. So that might seem kind of not good, but there are cards that felicitate being called from drop. So getting that crit is actually has a lot of pressure. So it's pretty decent. And then the other one, if it's a trigger unit, you actually get a counter charge, which a lot of the times is completely refunding the cost, or at least making a CB1. And then you choose a card from your drop and call it. So now the card you call from drop doesn't get a crit anymore. So this is really, if you have a trigger on top and you can't like move it around, it's fine to do that, and you can just call back some utility pieces, something you might want to bounce back to your hand, more defensive, extra persona rides. That's usually when you want to use a trigger unit, or there's another one, another card that benefits from that. And there is a very key point of text here. It says return the revealed card to its original spot. So if you reveal that trigger unit, it doesn't go into your hand. It stays on top for when you're getting ready to attack. So let's say you activate this and you reveal the top card into the over trigger. Well, it just stays there, and then you get a swing. So again, pretty good in that sense. It does get kind of heavy with the cost eventually, but there are ways of circumventing it. But for the most part, it is very toolboxy, a very toolboxy deck, and I just really am enjoying it right now. Alright, we're going to be getting started off with the grade 3s. So pretty essential. 3 persona rides. Pretty good in this deck. You do have a restanding unit, so you do want to be able to give that blanket 10k, and there are ways of actually, if you mill this, or you can reveal this off the top of your deck and add it to your hand, and then it's ready for next turn. But if you mill this and it's in your drop zone, you can actually reborn an extra copy of your Persona Ride. Most of the time you want to be doing that if you have a critical on top of your deck and you're not even going to get the crit, so might as well call this out and bounce it back. We'll be talking about how you bounce things back in a little bit. If you're familiar with the new lyrical set, then you probably already know. But for the most part, Persona Ride is pretty essential in this deck, and it's really good. Alright, and so for the other grade 3 we're running in this deck, we are only running one more. It is actually going to be this card, Floriza. This is a ghost support card. It's supposed to be for Feltyrosa, but the wording of the text makes it usable in this deck. Its effect is that when it's placed from rear, except from hand, until the end of the turn, it gets the Battle Door effect, where if it swings, your opponent has to call 2 or more at the same time. So this card is actually pretty good in this deck. If you can't get the... This is pretty good if you can't get the crit, or even if you do. And mostly, this is good for if you're going first. Because your other card that you want to revive only works if your opponent is on grade 3. So if you need to call something to give extra pressure, because you want to be using Meidell's skill every single turn. So using this gives you that pressure that you need, where it's either, assuming it has 2 criticals, they either take the 2 crit attack or they give you 2 cards from their hand. Either way, it's pretty good. Running it at 2 because it is a little bricky, and once you have 1 in the drop zone, you really don't need another one. And you do go through this deck pretty quickly. There's a lot of filtering and a lot of top deck checking, and you can, if you draw this, you can just discard it. So it is just 2 copies. It's been working out pretty well for me. Alright, so moving on to the grade 2s, we have the main reborn target, which is this triple rare from the new set, Annalise. So this card has 2 skills. Unfortunately, both of them are locked on your opponent being grade 3, so this card doesn't really do anything going first. So its first skill is that whenever it attacks a grade 3 or greater unit, not necessarily the Vanguard, it gets 5k. So it's a 15k swinger, which is really good. And then if it's placed from drop on rear by the ability of Meidell, it gets the skill that at the end of the battle that your Vanguard attacks, you can Soul Blast 1 and stand this unit. So when you combo that with Meidell's skill, let's say you reveal a normal unit on the top of the deck, you add it to your hand, and then you reborn this. It gets called into this one. It's swinging at Vanguard for 15 or 25, depending on if you're on Persona Ride. So you swing 15 or 25 with 2 critical because those were born with the normal unit effect. Now your Vanguard attacks, you put any triggers you want on this, you get on this card, and then you Soul Blast 1, restand it. So you're swinging twice with double critical. The funniest thing about this is that this actually gets countered by both counter heals because it's attacking twice and it has an extra crit. So that's just like a funny interaction. But for the most part, this is your best reborn target. And it is important to note that once you put it on the board, you do want to intercept with it. So unless you have another copy and drop, so that you can actually reborn it and do the same thing again. So once again, yeah, this is our best reborn target other than the Ghost Girl. But it only works when you're going second or you're on your turn 4. So, alright, and the other grade 2 we are playing in this deck is this girl, Ninon. So she has a pretty interesting effect. When she's placed on rear, you get if you have a Meidell Vanguard, obviously, you check the top card of your deck, and you can either put it into the soul, and if you put it, you can choose to put it in the soul, and if you put it into the soul, you get a look at the top card of your deck. So this is one of the better cards to be facilitating, because you do need a lot of soul in this deck. So she's basically on play soul charge, and then you also get a look at the top card of your deck. So she's almost making up for the fact that you're looking at the top card and you're changing it. You're changing the top card of the deck. So this card is really good, and it is on place. So this is your main target that you want to be bouncing back to your hand in the early game, so you can call it soul charge and confirm what you do next. Like if you look at this and you see like an OT on top, you can just leave it there because you don't actually have to soul charge it. But this card is just really good. Alright, so moving on to the grade 1s, we're starting off with 3 copies of Yuika. So now this card is pretty pricey. If you don't want to play this card in your deck, I'll tell you later what you can replace with it. But let's just go over the skill. So it is a once per turn. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3, whenever something is placed in the same column as her, she gets an extra 5k. So she's a 13k booster, which is pretty good in this deck. And then that second skill is that at the end of the battle that it boosted a rearguard, you Soul Blast 1 and you bounce the rearguard that you boosted. So this is actually really good in this deck because you are reborning things. So you can reborn, you can guard with your OT, reborn it, call it in front of this, boost, and then Soul Blast 1 and return the OT to your hand. You can add PGs with this. You can add extra copies of Persona Ride. So this card is just so versatile in pretty much every single lyrical deck, which is why it's so expensive. I would be playing 4 copies. I only have 3 right now. I think that is actually pretty good for right now. Because it does this extra Soul Blast does kind of interfere with a lot of your plays. Because you do need a lot of soul for this deck in order to function. So you need to really manage your resources if you're going to be using this card, and you need to think about what you're going to be using for cost every single turn, if you have enough, and whether you can afford to use this. But for the most part, it is really good. As I said, you bounce Persona Rise in the early game. You want to be bouncing this girl because it literally pays for itself because you call her Soul Charge, most likely. And then you boost, Soul Blast what you just Soul Charge, and then bounce her back to your hand. And then next turn you can just call her Soul Charge again and look at the top card of your deck. So it's really good to just like be looping that. And that's why I think it's really worth playing this card in the deck. If you can't afford it or you don't want to buy it, I understand because this is not like a top tier deck. If you're going to be buying this card, you probably should be playing a much better deck. But if you really want to play this deck to its maximum potential, you do really need these cards. Alright, so moving on to one of the most important pieces in this deck, the 4 copies of Physalis. So this card is basically almost essential. If you do not have this card, you're probably going to be struggling a lot. Thankfully, you can what I always do is I always discard this for Ride deck, and then off the grade 1 skill, you can just reborn it. You definitely need this card on board, otherwise you're not doing a lot. So let's go over its skill. So it is a act once per turn, you Soul Blast 2, and choose one of your grade 3 or greater Vanguards with Meidell in its name. Until the end of turn, it gets an extra 5k, which is pretty important because that's 18, which is a nice magic number. And then its act ability cost becomes, instead of Counterblast 1, it becomes Counterblast 2. Instead of being Counterblast 2, it becomes Counterblast 1. So this card basically reads change Meidell's skill, instead of Counterblast 2, Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 2. And you get 5k in addition to that. So that's really important to make sure that you don't blast through all your Counterblast within like 1 or 2 turns. And do note that if you reveal Trigger Unit, that completely refunds Meidell's cost because it's Counterblast 1 and then Countercharge, call something out. But if you do get the normal unit, then that means you just Counterblast 1, call something back, give it a crit, add a card to your hand, and that is just so good, and it's so essential in order for the long game. Otherwise, you're using Meidell's skill like once or twice a game, which is very not optimal. It does have this other skill that when another unit is placed on rearguard from drop, it gets an extra 5k. Now that is not once per turn, but for the most part it is, because you can only reborn something with Meidell's skill once per turn. There is one other way to reborn something, but most of the time it's really not worth it. So this thing's usually just going to be a 13k booster, which with all your grade 2s is hitting really good magic numbers. So definitely a really essential piece for playing this deck. Alright, and next up we have another grade 1 that is here to help us manipulate the top of our deck, and it's to make sure we get the effect that we want. It is the 4 copies of Jute. So this card is a 7k base, which is kind of concerning, but for the most part, this card is kind of like a spell card where you play it down and use it immediately. So its skill is that its act, if you have a Meidell Vanguard, you can slide this into your soul, look at the top card of your deck, and you put it either on the top or the bottom of your deck. And then if you put the card on the bottom of your deck, you choose one of your units and you give it 5k. So this card is, like I said, you mostly just play it down and use the skill instantly. This card serves 2 purposes in the deck. One, it gives you enough soul, because if you're soul blasting 2 for Phyllis's skill, a lot of the times you might not have this the extra soul that you need in order to use Elise. So it's really important for that, to make sure you have enough soul for everything. And 2, it's obviously there to help you manipulate the top card of your deck to make sure that you do get what you need. I have had games where unfortunately I reveal like a trigger unit, and I really want to get a normal unit so I can get reborn Elise and give her the crit. So sometimes I will put the trigger on the bottom, which kind of hurts a little bit, but I think it's worth it most of the time to make sure that you get the effect that you need. And the 7k does hurt a little bit, but most of the time you can call this out early game, and then you put it behind an 8k booster, and that's hitting 15, which is still a magic number, and then next turn you can just slide it into soul, call something else there. So it's pretty good for that. I think it's pretty essential. Most of the time you're not even using this, and then the extra 5k is really nice because it's just like an extra way to like help you hit better numbers, and you can even give it to your Elise that you reborned. So yeah. Alright, and finishing off our normal units is going to be 2 copies of Astrid. So Astrid is probably the worst card in this deck. Let's just go over its effect. So it has a skill that activates in drop zone. So whenever you place a rear guard by the ability of your Meidell, you can counterblast 1 and call this card to an open rear guard circle. So if you are hurting for units, then you can just get a free unit from the drop zone whenever you use your Vanguard skill. The problem with this is that it's counterblast 1. Even if it were a Soul Blast, it'd be kind of heavy. But the fact that you're using another counterblast to just call something that's just an 8k, pretty much an 8k vanilla, is kind of terrible. But honestly, there isn't too much better to play. The only good thing about this is that this actually does proc Fistalis' skill. So you, instead of getting a 5k, it'll actually get 10k. Because that skill is not once per turn. It procs every time something gets reborn. But other than that, this card is not the greatest. If you really are in desperate need of a booster, it'll do in a pinch. But for the most part, it's really not worth reborning. Alright, so next up we have the 4 PGs. I'm using the Elf Girl because Meidell is a elf. And moving on to the trigger unit lineup, we have obviously Lyrical OT. We are playing for 8 crit. Because this deck really is high pressure with that extra critical, and you have a restanding unit, so, and Battle Door, so crits are really essential, especially if you can get them up to 4, and then you can make both of your rears lethal swings, then that is very, very good. Right, and for my 3 other triggers, I've opted to play front, mostly because I was playing with draws for a bit. It's pretty good because you really don't make very much hand advantage in this deck. Most of your hand advantage is coming from the fact that you're calling from drop and not using cards from hand. So draw, there is an argument for using draws, but I think fronts are just a little bit better because most of the time you're either swinging Elise, then Vanguard, and then Elise is standing itself. So with those force down that on her second swing, if you get a front, she does get the power even though you're swinging with one of the rear guards first. And if you don't have Elise, you're usually swinging with Vanguard first. So I think that fronts do work pretty well in this deck, and the extra shield is definitely really nice. And rounding off the deck profile, we have, of course, the 4 heals. I'm playing 1 crit counter heal for right now. Mostly it's because it's what I have, but I think that this lineup is not too bad. I mean, depending on your playstyle and what you have at your locals, you can always change out the heal ratios to fit whatever you think that you need. So that's it. Alright, so next up I just wanted to go over some of your ideal discard targets. So this deck is actually pretty interesting in the fact that you have a lot of cards that you want to discard for Ride deck, and you really don't mind because you're reborning from drop, so getting all those pieces into the drop zone is actually really good and not actually hurting you or minusing you. So the first discard outlet obviously is Astrid. Astrid wants to be in the drop zone, so you can obviously easily discard it for Ride deck. Next up is one of my favorite ones, either Phyllis or Yuika. So you might think, oh, these are actually super essential pieces. Why are you discarding them? The reason is because you can discard these, and then thanks to your grade 1s on Ride skill, you literally just reborn it out. So you're not minusing at all for a card that you were going to call to board anyway. So they actually are pretty decent. Despite being your most essential pieces, the fact that you're calling back stuff makes it them ideal discard targets because you can just call them back. Next up, we have this card. This is going on that line. This is another card that you don't really mind discarding, because even if you call it back at rest because you reveal a trigger unit, you can always just, even that turn, slide it into the soul, check top card of your deck. You probably don't want to do it and probably save it for your push turns, but just reborning a card that you would have called anyway, once again, just slide into the soul, help you pay for cost. Pretty good. Alright, so the last two good discard targets are obviously these cards, your reborn targets. These cards want to be in the drop zone anyway, so just put them there by discarding them for right deck. Alright, so next up I did want to go over some budget alternatives for Yuika. So my first thing that I would say is you could put in more copies of Astrid. She, as I said, she's not that great, but it is a recurable rearguard, so it's not terrible. So you can just play more copies of this. Alternatively, I would recommend playing this card, Shazame. She's just a 13k booster if your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater. Honestly, 13k booster is really good, and it's one of the reasons why Yukia is so good. This is basically just the worst Yukia, but it is 13k boosters, and you really want to be hitting that nice magic number of 28 whenever you're boosting Elise. So if you don't have the Yuikas, I would recommend 13k boosters or more Astrids. Right, so I figured we'd finish off with just a quick test hand and take a look at what your optimal board looks like. So starting off with 5 cards, let's take a look. So we got a Persona Ride, we got the grade 1, PG, and another Persona Ride, and another PG. So for this hand, I think I would probably shuffle back these 3. I don't need another Persona Ride yet. It's going to be a while before I can do that, and I can technically recycle just the 1. I don't need 2 PGs. It's going to be bad for early game, and this grade 1, I don't really need it right now. So I want to put them back and dig for some Elises and some Phyllises. So let's check top 3. Trigger, nice. At least, very good. Another trigger, not so great, but it's fine. So let's shuffle up and start the game. So we would draw for turn. Taking a look at this, we don't need this right now, so we would just discard it right into the grade 1. Let's say we take a damage. Unfortunately, we would have wanted that. Draw a card, and we got one anyway. We would discard. We're gonna be reborning something when we ride, so we'd probably want to discard this because it does have an on-play skill. So we just ride this, call this back. You have to reveal the top card of your deck to finish resolving. It's a normal unit, so she comes at stand, and then you proc her skill. You look at the top card of your deck. Since I already have a Persona Ride in hand, I'm gonna put this into the soul, and then we get a look at the top card of the deck. It's a normal unit. Not much we can do about that, and then we just swing, we get the card that we looked at, and then let's say we take another point of damage, and they swing again, and we guard, and then you stand, you draw for turn, another Persona Ride. Discard this, or maybe even the Persona Ride. Oh, we're going first, but let's just discard this, and then we ride into the Meidell. So unfortunately, we actually need a proc grade 3 skill, so we check top 3. Top 3. 1 on top, 2 to drop. So if you think you really need the PG, you can leave that on top, and then you'd be able to add that. Also, there's a heal trigger there, which is pretty good. So I think I'm going to go for the heal trigger since I already have a PG, and this is fine to drop anyway. So you would keep that there, put that down there, or put that on top. And then, unfortunately, we have to counterblast 2 for Meidell skill, so we just counterblast 2. Reveal the top card of deck. It's a trigger unit, so we can reborn anything. We countercharge, so it's basically counterblast 1, and then we can reborn one of these things. So there are 2 options in the drop zone. Right now you could go for hit pressure. Even though it doesn't have an extra critical, it's still pretty decent because that's 2 cards out of the hand, or you're getting a guaranteed damage. Or we could reborn this to use for later. Since we're not getting the crit, it doesn't matter whether it's a good attacker or not. So I think in this case I would reborn the grade 3. That we have some crit pressure. That crit is going to stay on top. And then we're just going to, or that heal is going to stay on top. Swing with Vanguard. What do you know? We got a heal trigger. And then nothing. Yuika. will be pretty good for next turn. And then we just swing, and that would be our first grade 3 turn. Not hugely impactful, but you do get a Battle Door hit, so probably hitting with that, and you heal down, so not terrible. Right, so last up, we're just going to take a look at what our optimal turn might be looking like. So we'd obviously be starting off with a Persona Ride, draw a card, and then we'd start calling out our board. So before we use Meidell's skill, we want to kind of guarantee what we have on top of our deck. So what I would do is call Yuika, or anything there, and then call out a Ninon, and then her skill will activate. You look at the top card of your deck. So you have two options here. If you really want that crit, which we kind of do want this turn because this is our push turn, you can leave it on top. But your other option, I always like to go for a soul charge because I'm a gambler. You would soul in and look at the top card of the deck. Oh, it's a critical trigger. So unfortunately, we really don't want a critical trigger because the card we're trying to reborn this turn is Elise, so that she can swing twice because the opponent is on grade 3. So what we would want to do is probably call another method of putting things on the bottom. So you call this, slide her into soul, check the top card. As cool as it is to have a crit on top, I'm going to put it on the bottom and then check the top card. Oh, it's an over trigger. Uh-oh. So if you reveal the over trigger, you honestly would want to keep it there. So let's use Phyllis's skill, Soul Blast 2, change her skill, Counter Blast 1 for her skill. And then since we know we have OT on top, what we can do is probably want to call... It honestly doesn't matter. You can either call this or you can call this because essentially they're both going to be swinging with the critical or the over trigger power once. So let's say I call this. We swing for 25, 1 crit, and then we would swing with Vanguard for 28. Let's say we get OT. Oh wow, who could see it coming? And then second check, heal, whatever, you give that, and then you restand her with a Soul Blast. Alright, so let's say that impossible situation didn't actually happen and you revealed just a normal unit. Then in that case, you would be calling this back, and she's now gets an extra crit, and she is 25 because of the Persona Ride. So what you would do is you would swing 25 at Vanguard, swing 28. This actually goes to your hand because when you reveal normal unit, it goes to your hand. Check. Not OT. Check. Nothing. Doesn't matter. Skill, Soul Blasts 1, restand, 25, 33. She gets an extra 5k because she was reborn. 38. Very nice magic number. 2 crit. Very, lot of pressure there. And then you would swing like this, 18, 23, 33. And in the battle, you Soul Blast 1, bounce her back to your hand so that you can call her again and Soul Charge. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed my deck profile of the Meidell deck. As I said, I've really been having a lot of fun with this deck. It's not the greatest, but there's just like so many working pieces and things that you have to manage and keep track of that I just enjoy it so much. So I hope you enjoyed. Go ahead and do the YouTube stuff if you want. And I'll see you next time.